Turning 35 felt like a turning point in my life, a chance to leave behind the insecurities and humiliations that had dogged me for years. My wife, Claire, and I had poured everything into making my birthday unforgettable. We rented a stunning house with a massive pool, a huge patio, and a sleek, modern kitchen perfect for entertaining. We stocked up on drinks, food, and decorations, determined to create a night to remember. By 3 p.m., guests started pouring in, friends, colleagues, and even a few old tormentors from work. Mark, Josh, and Tom, the three guys who had made my life miserable for years. I invited them on a whim, hoping that showing them my successful life, surrounded by people who respected me, would somehow shift the power dynamics. Perhaps they'd finally stop seeing me as the easy target they could belittle. It felt risky, but I was determined to rise above it all. The party was electric. The pool quickly became the center of attention, with everyone jumping in, playing games, and splashing around. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and I was finally starting to feel like I was on top of the world. For a moment, it felt like everything was going perfectly. Claire was the perfect hostess, flitting between groups, making everyone feel welcome. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice that she was spending less and less time around me. At first, I thought nothing of it. Claire was always social, always making sure everyone was having a good time. But as the minutes turned into hours, I realized I hadn't seen her in a while. She wasn't mingling with the usual crowd. Instead, she seemed to be lingering around Mark, Josh, and Tom. They were standing near the back of the house, away from the main party, talking in hushed tones and sharing private jokes. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that she was just being polite, that she was trying to be a good hostess even to those who didn't deserve it. But as I watched her laughing with them, touching her hair in that way she does when she's nervous or flirtatious, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I pushed the unease aside, focusing on my guests and trying to keep the party mood alive. But every time I looked for Claire, she was gone, slipping away into corners, disappearing behind closed doors. I started to feel uneasy, a creeping suspicion that something was going on. About 2 hours into the party, I was sitting at a table, talking and laughing with some friends, when I realized I hadn't seen Claire for quite some time. I excused myself and began searching for her. I called her name, but the music drowned out my voice. I checked the kitchen, the living room, even outside by the pool, but she was nowhere to be found. Just as I was about to head back downstairs, it struck me that I hadn't checked the guest bedroom at the far end of the hallway. The door was slightly open, and I could hear muffled voices and faint laughter. My heart pounded as I walked closer, a mix of dread and anger building inside me. I slowly pushed the door open, and what I saw inside shattered me completely. Mark, Josh, and Tom were standing there, completely naked, their clothes tossed carelessly on the floor. My wife, Claire, was on all fours in the center of the room, her body tangled with theirs in a scene of utter debauchery. It felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs, like I was watching some surreal nightmare unfold before my eyes. The same guys who used to mock me, humiliate me, were now with my wife in the most degrading way possible. My vision blurred with rage. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. All I saw were their smug faces, their hands all over her, and Claire giving herself to them without hesitation. I felt my blood boil, my fists clench, and without thinking, I lunged at them. But it was 3 against 1, and I didn't stand a chance. They overpowered me, shoving me back as I tried to swing at them. Josh's fist connected with my jaw, and I stumbled back, hitting the wall hard. My head was spinning, my thoughts a chaotic mess of betrayal and fury. I tried to get up, but another punch landed, knocking the wind out of me. I fell to the ground, dazed and disoriented, the room spinning around me. All I could see were their sneering faces, their mocking laughter echoing in my ears. Claire was crying, trying to cover herself, her eyes wide with shame and panic, but she didn't move to help me. She just stayed there, caught between them, as if paralyzed by the mess she had willingly stepped into. "Get out," one of them shouted, but I was too stunned to move. Claire's voice cracked through her sobs, "Please, just stop." But the last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of their cruel laughter and the sight of their naked bodies towering over me. As soon as I saw their penises, the world went black, and I lost consciousness, sinking into a void where none of this made any sense. I woke up to a blinding light and a pounding headache, my senses struggling to piece together where I was. The steady beep of a heart monitor and the sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air. I was in a hospital room, lying on a stiff bed, my head wrapped in bandages. It felt like I'd been run over by a truck. Claire was sitting by my side, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. As soon as she saw me stirring, she jumped up, grabbing my hand tightly. "Oh my God, you're awake," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and fear. I blinked, trying to remember how I ended up here. Flashes of the party came back. Laughing with friends, searching for Claire, finding that room, and then, nothing. My head throbbed as I tried to piece it all together. I looked at Claire, my throat dry, and asked the only question that made sense at the moment: what happened? She hesitated, her eyes darting away as if searching for the right words. "You were drunk," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "You fell down the stairs. The doctors said you hit your head pretty badly." Something about her explanation felt off, but I was too groggy to push further. I nodded weakly, still trying to make sense of the fragments in my mind. Claire leaned in closer, brushing her hand against my cheek. "I've been so worried about you," she said, her voice cracking. "You're going to be okay. The doctor said you just need to rest." For the next few days, Claire was by my side constantly. She played the role of the devoted wife perfectly, bringing me food, helping me with the medication, and even staying the night at the hospital. She was attentive, overly caring even, in a way that felt suffocating. I noticed she was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, glancing nervously at her phone as if she was expecting something terrible to happen. Despite her care, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My memories were still foggy, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't recall anything beyond walking into that room. I thought I'd fallen, but the way my body felt, the bruises, the cuts, didn't line up with just a simple fall. The doctors assured me my memory would return, but as each day passed, the blank space in my mind remained stubbornly empty. Claire's behavior grew stranger. She seemed distant and anxious, flinching whenever I mentioned the party. At first, I thought it was guilt over the accident, but it was more than that. She was hiding something big. One afternoon, while Claire was in the cafeteria, her phone buzzed on the bedside table. I picked it up, intending to silence it, but the name flashing on the screen caught my attention: House Manager. It was odd. We hadn't rented the house in my name. Claire had handled everything. I answered the call, trying to sound casual. "Hello." A woman's voice on the other end sounded relieved. "Oh, finally. I've been trying to reach you. I have all the security footage on the flash drive, and I'm ready to hand it over tonight." I felt a jolt of adrenaline shoot through me. "What footage?" I asked, my voice tinged with suspicion. "The footage from your birthday party," she explained. "Your wife specifically asked for the recordings. I have them here, every camera, every angle." I paused, trying to mask the shock in my voice. "Can I pick it up tonight?" I asked, my mind racing. There was a brief hesitation on her end, but she agreed, setting up a meeting for midnight at her office. I hung up, my heart pounding in my chest. Why did Claire need the security footage? Why was she so desperate to get her hands on it? That evening, I told Claire I was tired and needed some rest. As soon as she left the room, I slipped out of the hospital, driving to meet the woman with the footage. I didn't want to wait. I needed answers. When I finally got the flash drive, I couldn't wait to see what was on it. I sat in my car, plugged it into my laptop, and braced myself. The first few clips were innocent enough. Shots of people arriving, laughing, drinking by the pool. But then I found the file marked Camera 5, the one facing the hallway near the guest bedroom. My pulse quickened as I hit play. There was Claire, slipping into the room with Mark, Josh, and Tom. They were laughing, talking casually, almost like old friends. It made my skin crawl to see her so comfortable with the very men who had tormented me for years. As I watched, one of them reached out, touching her inappropriately. Claire didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned into it, her smile widening. Then they started to undress. My heart sank as I watched the scene unfold in painful clarity. They took turns with her, using her as if she were nothing more than a plaything. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had ever felt. I sat there, frozen, unable to look away as my wife gave herself to the men who had made my life a living hell. Then I saw myself on the screen, storming into the room, shouting, trying to fight. I could see the rage in my eyes, the way I swung wildly at them before they ganged up and beat me down. I watched as I fell, my body crumpling to the floor while Claire stood there, paralyzed by her own choices. I shut the laptop with a trembling hand, my mind reeling from the horrific reality. Everything made sense now: why Claire had been so attentive, so desperate to keep me from remembering. She wasn't just guilty, she was complicit in my pain, in my humiliation. The ride back home was a blur. I sped down the highway, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. Rage, shame, and betrayal coursed through me, threatening to explode. When I walked into the house, I didn't even look at Claire. I didn't have to say anything, she could see it in my eyes. She tried to speak, but I didn't let her get a word in. "You lied to me," I seethed, my voice low and dangerous. "You let them do that to you, you let them humiliate me in my own house on my birthday." Claire broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, but I didn't care. Her tears couldn't erase what I'd seen. I turned away, leaving her on the floor, and slammed the bedroom door behind me, knowing this was just the beginning of the end. The days that followed were a blur of anger, disbelief, and a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal that I couldn't shake. Claire hovered around me constantly, her eyes filled with guilt and desperation, but I couldn't stand to look at her. Every time I saw her, all I could see was the footage playing on a loop in my mind, her with those men, their mocking laughter, and my helplessness on the floor. I pretended to be lost in my thoughts, but every second was spent piecing together what had led to this. I knew I needed answers, but I also knew that whatever Claire told me would never be enough. The footage had said it all, and yet there was still so much I didn't understand. But why had she done it? And why with him? Claire's attempts to care for me only fueled my resentment. She was always there, fussing over my every move, pretending like she was the perfect wife who'd made one terrible mistake. The doctors had said my memory would come back in time, but I didn't need to remember more. I had seen it all. But still, the lies she told me about the accident, about how I had supposedly fallen down the stairs in a drunken stupor, burned in my mind. One afternoon, as Claire busied herself in the kitchen, I decided to confront her. I couldn't take the charade any longer. I marched in, my heart pounding in my chest, and stared at her until she stopped what she was doing. She looked at me, eyes wide and nervous. "What happened that night, Claire?" I demanded, my voice trembling with barely controlled rage. She tried to play innocent, tears welling up in her eyes instantly. "I already told you you fell. Stop lying." I slammed my fist on the counter, startling her. "I've seen the footage. I know everything." Claire's face drained of color. She backed away, her hands shaking as she covered her mouth. I didn't know you." "Why, Claire? Why did you do it?" I interrupted, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. "Why them? Those three? After everything they did to me?" She sank onto a chair, her body trembling. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It just happened." "That's not good enough." I roared. "You destroyed everything. You betrayed me with those guys who treated me like dirt for years, and you think it just happened is an excuse." Claire broke down, burying her face in her hands. I watched her crumble, feeling nothing but cold disdain. She started mumbling, trying to piece together some explanation, but her words were all over the place: desperation, regret, but no real reason, nothing that could justify the gut-wrenching betrayal I'd witnessed. I stormed out of the house, leaving her sobbing in the kitchen. I needed space, air, anything to clear my head. I drove aimlessly around the city, every road leading nowhere, just like my thoughts. How had my life spiraled into this mess? How could Claire, the woman I'd loved and trusted for years, betray me in the most humiliating way possible? Late that night, I returned home to find Claire sitting in the living room, still crying. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen, and before I could retreat to the bedroom, she spoke, her voice hoarse and desperate. "They were mocking you," she said, choking on her words. "They were saying things about you, how you're weak, how they could do whatever they wanted to you and you wouldn't do anything about it." I froze, her words cutting through me like a blade. "And you went along with it?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was drunk, they kept pushing and I don't know what I was thinking. I thought maybe if I went along, they'd stop, they'd leave you alone." She paused, her sobs making it hard to continue. "I thought I could control it, but I couldn't." Claire's words made me feel even more pathetic. She hadn't just betrayed me, she'd done it because she thought it would make me look stronger, that somehow letting them use her would stop them from bullying me. It was twisted, nonsensical, and utterly demeaning. The fact that she believed such a warped lie only deepened my sense of betrayal. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and left the house, not caring where I ended up. I found myself driving toward the house we'd rented for the party. I needed to see it again, to make sense of the chaos. As I parked outside, memories of the night rushed back. The laughter, the music, the feeling of being on top of the world just hours before it all came crashing down. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty, cold space. The house was silent now, devoid of the life and joy that had filled it just days before. I walked down the hallway to the room where I'd found Claire. The door was still ajar, as if inviting me to relive the moment that had torn my world apart. I stood in the doorway, staring at the spot where I'd seen them all, and a wave of fury surged through me. I kicked the wall, punched the door, letting out a scream of frustration that echoed through the empty house. I wanted to tear it all down, to burn away every reminder of that night, but it wouldn't change anything. The damage was done, and there was no going back. As I slumped against the wall, exhausted and broken, I knew I couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about Claire's betrayal, it was about reclaiming my dignity, my sense of self. I pulled out my phone, staring at the footage on the flash drive. I had to make them pay. All of them. Claire, Mark, Josh, Tom. They were all going to regret the day they decided to ruin my life. The days turned into a torturous blend of anger, planning, and a relentless drive for revenge. My thoughts were consumed with what I'd seen on that footage, and every second spent near Claire felt like suffocating under the weight of betrayal. I couldn't bear to look at her without seeing the twisted scene from the video, replaying in my mind every time I blinked. Claire's attempts to apologize became more frantic. She tried to explain herself in 1,000 different ways, each one more desperate than the last, but none of it mattered. I couldn't hear anything over the roaring noise in my head. I wanted her to feel the pain she had inflicted on me, to make her understand that there was no coming back from this. I avoided her as much as I could, pretending to sleep when she approached, eating meals alone in silence. She hovered constantly, scared to leave me alone for too long, knowing that every second we spent apart was a chance for me to slip further away. But it was already too late. My mind was no longer in our shared world. It was fixed on a single goal: vengeance. Every night, I locked myself in the spare room, replaying the footage on my laptop. I studied every second, memorizing the details of Mark, Josh, and Tom's faces, their mocking expressions, and Claire's ashamed, panicked looks. The more I watched, the deeper my resolve grew. I knew I couldn't just let this go. I couldn't simply forgive and move on. They had to pay. I spent hours in that room, planning how I would get my revenge. I scoured social media, digging into their lives, learning their routines, their vulnerabilities. I wanted to strike where it would hurt the most. I considered everything, from ruining their careers to humiliating them publicly, to destroying their personal lives the way they had destroyed mine. The ideas swirled in my mind, each one more vengeful than the last. Then I found my opportunity. Mark's wife, Lucy, was a well-known real estate agent in town, a woman with a spotless reputation. She had no idea what her husband was really like. I made a fake email account, attaching a carefully edited clip from the footage, just enough to reveal Mark's infidelity without exposing the full extent of Claire's involvement. I hit send and imagined the chaos that would unfold. It wasn't just Mark. Josh was heavily involved in his family business, a company he'd inherited and was desperate to keep afloat. I found their business email and forwarded the footage anonymously, making sure it reached his father, the current CEO. Josh had a lot to lose: his position, his reputation, and everything his father had worked to build. I wanted to see it all come crashing down. Finally, there was Tom. The most arrogant of the bunch, Tom prided himself on his standing in the community, always the loudest voice at the local club meetings, the one who bragged about his connections. I sent the footage to the entire club's board, ensuring that every single one of his so-called friends saw what kind of man he really was. It didn't take long for the fallout to start. The very next day, my phone buzzed with notifications as word spread about Mark's infidelity. I watched from behind the screen as Lucy's social media posts turned from family outings and happy smiles to cryptic quotes about betrayal and heartbreak. Mark's world was unraveling, and it was only the beginning. Josh was next. A few days later, I overheard a heated argument outside his house as I drove by, his father's voice booming through the open window. It was clear that Josh's place in the family business was hanging by a thread. The once pristine lawn of his house was now cluttered with garbage bags and moving boxes. I felt a sick sense of satisfaction knowing that his perfect little life was crumbling from the inside. Tom's downfall was the most public. Within a week, his name was all over the club's forums. His once respected reputation turned to ashes. He tried to play it off as a misunderstanding, but the footage was undeniable. His attempts to save face only made things worse, and soon he was forced to resign from his beloved club, slinking away in disgrace. While all this was happening, Claire kept to herself, too scared to even ask what was going on. I hadn't told her about my revenge plan. I wanted her to feel every moment of tension, every awkward silence, and every question that went unanswered. She didn't know that I had started leaking the footage, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew something was wrong, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it caught up to her. One night, Claire approached me hesitantly. She tried to touch my arm, but I recoiled. "What are you planning?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can feel it. I know you're doing something." I looked at her, my expression cold and unfeeling. "You don't get to ask me anything," I replied flatly. "You lost that right when you let them destroy everything we had." Claire broke down again, sobbing uncontrollably, but I felt nothing. I watched her crumble, knowing that this was only the beginning of her punishment. I left her there, in the dark of our living room, crying alone, and walked out onto the porch, breathing in the cool night air. I wasn't done yet. There was still more to be done. Claire's day of reckoning was coming, and when it did, she would regret every single decision she had made that night. I stared up at the stars, feeling the weight of my choices. This wasn't who I used to be, but I couldn't turn back now. I would make sure that everyone involved felt the full force of my fury. I would make them all wish they'd never crossed me. Days turned into weeks, and the fallout from my revenge rippled through their lives like a wrecking ball. Mark, Josh, and Tom, once the untouchable kings of our office, were now scrambling to keep their personal and professional lives from falling apart. The satisfaction of seeing them suffer, knowing I was the architect of their downfall, filled the emptiness that Claire had left inside me. Mark's wife, Lucy, had thrown him out. I'd seen him outside their house one night, yelling and begging her to let him back in. She didn't even open the door, she just shouted through the window, telling him to take his things and leave. He looked pathetic, slumped on the curb, clutching his phone, probably trying to call the few friends he had left. It was a far cry from the smug, arrogant man I'd known for years. Josh's situation was even worse. His father had suspended him from the family business, pending an internal review. The once bustling office that Josh had proudly run was now a ghost town. I heard rumors that his father was planning to cut him out entirely, selling off assets and restructuring to distance the family name from Josh's scandals. Every time I drove past the building, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of him sitting inside, alone and powerless. And then there was Tom. His resignation from the club was just the beginning. His wife had taken their kids and moved in with her sister, leaving Tom to deal with the aftermath on his own. His once perfect life was in ruins, and the news had spread like wildfire through our community. The same people who used to praise him were now whispering behind his back, treating him like a pariah. But as gratifying as their downfall was, it still wasn't enough. Claire was still living under my roof, her guilt simmering just below the surface. But she hadn't yet faced the full consequences of her betrayal. I was determined to make sure she did. Claire's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She jumped at every sound, checked her phone obsessively, and avoided eye contact whenever I was in the room. She had become a shadow of the woman she once was, constantly on edge, always looking over her shoulder. I watched her unravel day by day, knowing that her fear was only the beginning of what she deserved. One evening, as we sat in awkward silence at the dinner table, I decided it was time to push her further. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the photos I'd taken of her with those men, intimate, damning moments frozen in time. I slid the phone across the table, letting the images linger in front of her. Claire's face went pale as she stared at the screen, her fork clattering onto her plate. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and shame. "Because you don't get to pretend this didn't happen," I replied coldly. "You don't get to just move on like nothing's wrong. You need to understand what you've done." Claire pushed the phone away, tears streaming down her face. "I know I messed up," she said, her voice breaking. "I hate myself for it every day. I don't even recognize who I am anymore." "Good," I said, my tone icy. "You're finally seeing what I see. A liar, a cheat, someone who threw away everything for a few moments of attention." She covered her face, sobbing uncontrollably, but I didn't stop. I needed her to feel the weight of what she had done, to know that she would never be able to escape it. "You think you're sorry now? This is just the beginning, Claire. You're going to pay for this every single day." After that, Claire retreated into herself even more, barely speaking, barely eating. She moved around the house like a ghost, haunted by the memories of her own actions. I could see it in her eyes. She was terrified of what would happen next, of how far I would go to make her suffer. And that's exactly where I wanted her. I wasn't done yet. I knew that simply tormenting Claire wasn't enough. She needed to be completely humiliated, just like she had humiliated me. I decided to leak parts of the footage anonymously to a few key people who would make sure it spread. I sent clips to her closest friends, to some of our neighbors who thrived on gossip, and even to a few of her coworkers. I didn't care who saw it, I just wanted everyone to know the truth. The response was immediate and vicious. Claire's phone blew up with messages from people demanding explanations, some of them horrified, others eager to drag her name through the mud. I watched her crumble under the pressure, struggling to answer the flood of accusations and questions. She tried to deny it at first, but the footage was too clear, too undeniable. Her reputation was in tatters, and there was no hiding from the shame. One night, I caught her on the phone with one of her friends, pleading for sympathy. "It was a mistake," she cried. "I don't know why I did it. I wasn't thinking straight. Please, you have to believe me." But the friend wasn't having it. "How could you do that to him? To your own husband? I don't even know who you are anymore." The call ended abruptly, and Claire threw her phone across the room in frustration, sinking to the floor in a mess of tears. I stood in the doorway, watching her break down, feeling a twisted sense of vindication. This was exactly what I wanted, to see her stripped of all her pretenses, laid bare in front of the world. I wanted her to feel as humiliated as I had felt when I walked into that room. Still, the satisfaction was fleeting. I realized that no amount of revenge could erase what had been done. I could ruin their lives, I could make Claire pay, but it wouldn't change the fact that the person I loved and trusted had betrayed me in the worst way possible. The truth was that I wasn't just destroying their lives, I was destroying myself in the process. Late one night, as Claire lay asleep in the guest room, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the flickering glow of the TV. My thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and a bitter realization that revenge would never fill the void that Claire's betrayal had left in me. I knew what had to come next. I needed to end this, to walk away before I lost what little was left of myself. But I couldn't let Claire off the hook that easily. I had one final move left, one last act that would ensure she would never forget what she'd done. I picked up my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen as I typed out the message that would seal her fate. I would make sure that she lost everything, just as I had. And once it was done, I would finally be free of her. I spent the following days in a state of cold, calculated focus. Claire was now a shell of herself, barely able to look me in the eye, living each day in a quiet, fearful dread. She stayed holed up in the guest room most of the time, avoiding the harsh light of reality that I had forced upon her. The footage had done its work, spreading like wildfire, and the whispers were everywhere, at her workplace, in our neighborhood, and among the people she once called friends. The humiliation she faced was relentless. I overheard her one morning crying on the phone to her boss, begging to keep her job. "I made a mistake," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of shame. "Please, just give me another chance." But the call ended the same way all the others had: cold, unforgiving rejection. Claire's fall from grace was complete. The once confident woman who had captivated me was now a pariah, abandoned by everyone who had once supported her. The sting of betrayal had come full circle, and she was paying the price in the most brutal way possible. But still, it wasn't enough. I knew that as long as she remained in the house, the cycle of pain and bitterness would never end. I couldn't move on while she was still a part of my life, even as a broken, pitiful figure. I needed to sever the last ties, to end this saga once and for all. I had already set the divorce papers in motion. My lawyer was relentless, ensuring that every detail favored me, stripping Claire of everything she had. The house, our savings, everything was mine. Claire's betrayal had left her with nothing, and I wanted her to feel every ounce of that loss. One evening, as Claire sat silently at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her untouched dinner, I laid the final papers in front of her. "Sign them," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "It's over." She looked up at me, her eyes hollow, filled with a mixture of despair and resignation. "You've taken everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have nothing left." I didn't respond. I just watched as she picked up the pen, her hand trembling as she scrawled her name on the dotted line. With each stroke, she signed away the last remnants of our life together, the life she had thrown away for a fleeting moment of validation. The finality of it settled in, and for the first time, I saw the full extent of what we had both lost. Claire gathered her things that night, stuffing a few clothes and personal items into a worn-out suitcase. She moved like a ghost, her movements slow and heavy, as if the weight of her actions was dragging her down. I stood by the door, watching her go without saying a word. She paused on the doorstep, glancing back one last time, as if hoping for some final shred of forgiveness. But I had nothing left to give. The door closed behind her with a final, echoing thud. I watched from the window as she walked down the driveway, her figure swallowed by the darkness. Claire was gone, and I was finally alone in the house that once felt like home but now felt like a cold, empty shell. I turned back to the mess that was our living room, the remnants of my birthday party still scattered around as a haunting reminder of how everything had unraveled. The decorations, the empty bottles, the torn streamers, they all seemed to mock me now, remnants of a night that had started with so much promise and ended in utter devastation. I poured myself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as I stared into it, lost in the memories of everything that had happened. My mind drifted back to that afternoon. The laughter, the music, the feeling of invincibility. How naive I had been, thinking that this party could change the way people saw me, could make me feel like I finally belonged. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had torn away every illusion I had, exposing the ugly truth of my life. The betrayal, the humiliation, the anger, it had all come crashing down in that rented house, leaving me with nothing but a fractured sense of self and a desperate need for retribution. I downed the drink in one gulp, feeling the burn as it slid down my throat. The numbness set in, dulling the sharp edges of my thoughts but never truly erasing them. I sat there for hours, replaying every moment in my mind, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. And then it hit me. In my quest for revenge, I had become just as lost as Claire. I had torn apart not just her life, but my own as well. The satisfaction of seeing her suffer had been fleeting, replaced by a deep, hollow emptiness that I couldn't ignore. I had wanted to make her feel my pain, but in the process, I had lost myself. The sun began to rise, casting a faint glow through the windows as the new day dawned. I stared at the light creeping across the floor, feeling the weight of everything I had done settle on my shoulders. There was no going back, no way to undo the choices that had led me here. All I could do now was live with the consequences. I stood up, looking around at the wreckage of my once perfect life. It was all gone now, Claire, my sense of security, the illusion of control. I had nothing left but the bitter memories of that night, a night that had started with hope and ended in heartbreak. I raised my glass one final time, staring into the emptiness. The house was silent, the echoes of the past still haunting every corner. This was my reality now, the price I had paid for a moment of revenge. I took a deep breath, the weight of it all pressing down on me, and muttered under my breath, almost as if to myself, "This is a birthday I will never forget."